just to kick off the discussion, I've got one question that was in my mind, which relates to the finance, but also to the sort of policy side in terms of really trying to take things forward. Because I often hear people say in discussions, when I go to discussions on green finance, something along the lines of, these are asset managers, asset owners saying, oh, we'd be very happy to buy green bonds, whatever, but there aren't enough of them. And it makes me wonder how far finance can actually drive change, or how far really we have to have other policy initiatives that are changing things on the ground in order that people are coming up with the right projects, and then the finance sector can step in. So can finance really be so smart and come up with all these instruments that somehow or other mean that change happens, or does finance require government also to be making the right sort of policy changes, and businesses to be much more proactive in developing these sort of strategies that Eric spoke about? Jonathan, do you want to go first, perhaps?
Maya, thank you. That's a nice question to get us going. Look, I think finance clearly has a role to play. It's very important, I think, for intermediaries like us to make sure that we are bringing cost-effective capital to attractive investment opportunities. But I think it's also true that finance alone can't turn an unattractive financial proposition into an attractive one. Well, certainly commercial finance cannot. And commercial banks, by their very, what it says on the tin, they're commercial banks. Their main role is not to provide subsidized financing. So I think finance clearly does have a role. I think one of the areas where finance and the financial markets need to address is certain inefficiencies, and I think this is what certainly the whole movement towards increased disclosure is driving about. Are financial institutions and are the financial markets pricing risk properly? And that's, I think, in the opening sentence of the TCFD recommendations, because if the markets aren't doing that because it's not good information, it's not good risk analysis, then that is as it were, a market failure that needs to be addressed, and that the players in the financial markets need to rethink their risk and pricing approach to address that. So I think overall I would say finance has a role, but to the broader context of your question, all of the actors on this stage of human endeavor have their roles to play. So governments must do things, policymakers must do things, the public must do things by expressing opinions, as Robert talked about earlier. Corporates must behave responsibly, corporates must develop technologies, banks must support their roles. Civil society, of course, has a key role in making sure that good behavior is maintained and all parties are held to account. So finance has a role, but it won't do it on its own, and no party will do it on its own.
Okay, great, thank you. And Alex, would you like to comment too? Thank you.
Yes, I just make one point to add to that. I think somebody earlier was talking about carrot and stick, and I think that's very important. I mean, regulation clearly plays a role here, and at the same time, I think that we do need to facilitate and encourage activity to allow people to meet those regulations. One of the points about scaling up investing, particularly in low carbon energy and infrastructure, is that there are actually quite significant market failures in terms of information and awareness and capacity. And so a lot of institutions in this part of the world are not investing or lending to these kind of sectors because they're not aware of the opportunities, and they view them as being excessively risky because they don't know about them, and they don't have the experience or the skills to analyze the risks and to go through the process that Jonathan was talking about. And so I think in addition to the stick, we actually do need to think about providing carrots in terms of education and helping some of these institutions to participate in transactions and to learn by doing, which is, I think, something we also heard about earlier. And that can really encourage increasing activity in the future.
Okay, thanks. And Eric, if you'd like to comment as well, maybe on this role of finance, business and government in effect.
So I think obviously the regulations and what I call the institutional framework helps in reducing uncertainty. And it goes back to risk. So as a business, if I want to invest in something, it will be helpful if the uncertainty in 5 years' time is reduced. One of the things is incentives, right? How do I get my return on investment in the building? If there are incentives, then I can do calculation and so on. So I think truly the regulations and carrot and stick does play a big role in changing what we are talking about, this great transition. Hopefully when it gets going, then this can be self-generating, market-driven. But having said that, I think we also have to note that different places are different contexts. Some places are top-down driven, some places are bottom-up driven. So a regulation that works in A will not work in B. And I give an example of taxes. You know, some places you have high taxes, some places you have low taxes. So what I call the Goldilocks effect is very important in regulation. They're just nice, because if you set it too high, you get evasion. You get people bypassing it, so there's no effect. And if you set it too low, then so it's something that is worth looking into. The German experience with Energiewende is an interesting learning. You know, the goal was set very high. It's creating a bit of unhappiness in the society. There's even a north-south divide because the renewables are in the north and the big consumers are in the south. So certain things is worth looking into. But I think in principle, we do need carrot and sticks to get something moving. So.
Okay, right, great. I think we've got a sort of broad agreement as to the importance of all these different players, the finance side, the corporates and businesses and government in getting the right sort of policy framework in place. Now, as we've only got very little time, I'd like to perhaps take questions from the floor again in, say, three questions at a time, if we've got questions, of course. Got the gentleman over there. Anybody else with a question? Okay, Andrea over there. Okay, so we have 2 questions then.
Okay, it's Paul from CLP. I would like to ask the question, Eric, is about this Germany situation about you have increased in renewable to 30%, but the carbon content of the generation increased because they don't use gas fire and they run the coal fire harder. And actually, I've seen a brand new gas-fired power station, latest technology, not running for months or even years. It's just sitting there. So how will we address this concern? And also, they stop generating use nuclear, but they buy nuclear from Germany and from France and from Belgium. So how would Germany address this issue? And would this trend be followed by other countries like China? Because if this is followed by other countries, then I think the whole issue about reducing carbon from the energy sector, which really does not work.
Okay, thank you. Andrea, just a quick question.
Yes. A quick question then. For Hong Kong, what do you, well, for each panelist, what do you think what Hong Kong could do to take a bigger role in the whole climate finance agenda? It is very, very broad. I know that after more than 10 years, since I looked at this agenda, finally the Hong Kong government made some commitment, a small step on green bond, but there are also many other aspects that, you know, are important within this space. So pick your brain.
Okay, thank you. Let's go with Eric first then. Eric, would you like to answer the question on Germany?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy task. When the Energiewende was announced, all Germans were behind it because it's indeed a noble goal to, let me read the numbers, by 2050, 80 to 95% reduction in CO2 compared to 1990 levels, 80% share in renewables, and so on. But it is proving to be a difficult task. Like I say, some unintended consequences. If you go to people in the north, they are not so happy because they're getting all the wind power and the people in the south are enjoying it, and so on. So there's a sort of a social divide. And one of the things, Paul rightly points out, is some unintended consequences, particularly with a carbon price of carbon. It is so low that it is cheaper to buy that off the market and run a coal plant. And that's why you have gas-fired brand new. I know which plant Paul is talking about, brand new plant that we visited, and there were 4 persons in the whole plant because it was not running, unfortunately. And next door there was a coal plant that was running. So I think that for sure the energy vendor is a good learning for all. Hong Kong is going through a transition. Some of the things, I think one of the maybe a bit too genie is you cannot move too fast sometimes. You have to take it one step at a time. And in retrospect, I think the German government wish it has been a bit slower, but now they are trying to catch up. So one of the things, unfortunately, is if you read about it, they are looking at increasing the price of carbon credits. So, but then that's not a solution, I suppose. So no easy answer, but certainly to learn from each other.
Okay, thanks very much, Eric. And Alexandra, can I ask you to briefly reply to Andrea's question?
Yes, thank you. Well, I've been on a mission for the last couple of months to sell the idea that Hong Kong should make this very bold move to establish itself as the regional centre for green finance by setting up an institution known as a green investment bank. Now, a lot of the people in this room have heard me talk about this, so I really don't want to test their patience. So let me just say that this is a new kind of financial institution. It's capitalized with government money, and its mission is to catalyze private financing for low carbon energy and infrastructure. There are various models around the world of institutions like this and case studies, and they have been extremely successful. Here in Asia, we have this enormous financing gap for infrastructure. It's all got to be financed somewhere. And so I think it would be great if we could funnel a large portion of that funding through Hong Kong and leverage on our existing skills with project finance and our sort of deep and liquid capital markets. And I won't take any more of your time, but there's a very large paper on the subject that I can send you if you are at all interested.
Okay, thanks. We'll probably put this, there will be a report on this event and we'll put the details on it. Okay, Jonathan, would you
I shall try and be brief, yes. Close to my heart, and I think behind Paul's question is sort of gas as a transition fuel to take us towards a 2 degrees C environment, and clearly CLP has done exactly that here in Hong Kong. New highly efficient gas-fired turbines sourced out of Germany, generating at, I expect, less than 400 grams per kilowatt hour and displacing older generation from older coal-fired units that may be burning, more than 1,000 grams produce more than 1,000 grams per kilowatt hour. We on the finance side have certain similar challenges around what we do around coal and clean coal particularly. We are still financing high ultra supercritical coal-fired plants in low-income markets. We're doing that because we can see where we as an institution step away. They can be built and developed very inefficiently by parties who are not adopting the highest standards, and we don't think it's necessarily right to walk away from highly efficient coal-fired plants and then at the same time be financing the import of heavy sulfur fuel oil into those markets, which is going to be an even more inferior environmental outcome. But that's obviously a tough balance, a tough decision that we have to make, but that's really the sort of thinking behind how our policies have evolved. Hong Kong as a green financial centre, absolutely. Great to see the government doing bonds. What would I do next? Well, a little bit to Alex's point, beyond a green investment bank, which I think is a great idea. I think education. I think a sustainability institute here in Hong Kong that can promote regional leadership around both sustainability, sustainable financing as well. I think that would be a very doable and feasible idea, and I'm pretty confident it would be backed by the very strong educational establishments that we already have in Hong Kong. And thinking of those as well, another area I touched upon when I spoke there around carbon pricing. I'm not an expert, but it seems to me that this would be very doable here in Hong Kong to introduce carbon pricing. I think there would be support from the energy companies and all of the active players. And again, I know the academics and the experts at the universities would be able to make something very workable here in Hong Kong. So I think that would be another area that we could and should promote as part of that overall initiative to make Hong Kong play a full role in the area of finance and other areas.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Now, let's thank our panel first, and we've got some